Preventing another breakdown, some train services will be affected from next month so that any faulty cables and coils can be replaced.
Here comes a new contactless way of clearing checkpoints using facial and iris scans to identify travelers.
Stop squabbling and get the job done. Well, Malaysia's king tells MPs to pass the upcoming budget.
Hello, welcome to The Big Story, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. I'm Olivia Quay.
I'm Haryanto Diman. You can subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode.
Now, news just in. Commuters on the Tuas West extension of the East-West line can expect early closures, late openings and full Sunday closures from next month. These due to repair work scheduled to begin following the October 14th train disruption.
Early closures on the weekend will start from November and for limited periods in 2021. Commuters can also expect full Sunday closures. Now, if you recall, services across 3 train lines were concurrently shuttered for about 3 hours on October 14th, one of the most serious power-related incidents to hit the MRT network in recent years.
Well, SMRT, the Land Transport Authority and MRT train supplier Alstom apologized for the incident at a media briefing today. They explained that the breakdown was caused by a series of events.
First, the faulty cable between the Tuas Link and Tuas West Road stations on the East-West line combined with the malfunctioning of a circuit breaker at Tuas West Road station culminated in a power trip of the North-South and East-West lines. The breakdown of the Circle line was caused by an attempt to draw power from the Buona Vista intake substation.
Our staff in drawing power from Buona Vista intake, the cable fault should have been first isolated. But our power staff misread the graphics display and thought that the fault had been isolated and proceeded to take power, draw power from the Buona Vista intake. That caused a trip on the Circle line. The power staff and his supervisor has been suspended from their duties. They will be required to undergo retraining and recertification before they can resume duties.
Well, Alstom has committed to replacing all cables and trip coils along the affected stretch, which it will also pay for. LTA called the exercise a preemptive changeout.
Deputy News Editor Royston Sim was at the briefing and he joins us now to share more. Royston, the details in today's report differ from SMRT's preliminary findings about 2 weeks ago.
Hi, Haryanto. We basically found out more today than what we did 2 weeks ago, so it's basically an elaboration. So in the previous preliminary findings, we knew that, for instance, there was an insulation fault on the power cable and that the circuit breaker had failed. What we found out today is that the circuit breaker failed because there was a trip coil, which is a component within the circuit breaker, that had also malfunctioned. So as a result, so what's supposed to happen is when there's a power fault with the cable, the circuit breaker is supposed to isolate the fault between the relevant stations, in this case Tuas Link and Tuas West Road. But because the trip coil was faulty, the circuit breaker didn't work, and as a result, the secondary protection mechanism kicked in, and thus a much larger sector was affected. And so that covered the Tuas West extension. It extended all the way to Queenstown and also from Jurong East up to Woodlands. And that's because the secondary protection kicked in and it affected a much larger stretch. The other thing we also know and found out from the briefing today is that after this initial fault, what SMRT tried to do was to draw in power from the Buona Vista substation to try and recover service more quickly. And so what happened was that they had a staff member and also a supervisor go down to the substation, and what these staff members were supposed to do was to ensure that the fault was isolated before they started the process to draw power over. But they basically had an error. They made an error. It was a human error. They failed to notice on the display panel that actually the fault was not isolated. As a result, when they drew the power over or tried to draw the power over to the Tuas sector that caused a power trip, and as a result, a reasonably long stretch of the Circle Line from Harbourfront to Serangoon was down as well.
Right. So we know it was a bit of an extended disruption. So Royston, when we spoke to our colleague, senior transport correspondent Christopher Tan, one day after the breakdown, he said SMRT's response took longer than expected for the situation to be rectified, about 3.5 hours. So now that we know more details, was the long response time justified, you think?
Oh, I think it's still a really long time to recover service, and also today we found out that the incident affected 123,000 commuters in total, 110,000 on the north, south, and east, west lines, and 13,000 on the Circle Line. So one of the most major disruptions we've had in a very long time. The other thing we learned a bit more about today during the briefing was, we got a bit more insight into SMRT's thinking in terms of the recovery process. So when the fault in the western sector happened, they said they had two options. The first was basically to try and send a staff member down to the Tuas depot substation to try and rectify the fault there, but that would take quite a lot of time. So they decided to go for the quicker option to recover service, which was to draw power from the Buona Vista substation. But because that didn't work as well, in fact that caused the Circle Line to break down, that's when about maybe 40 minutes into the incident, they made the call that they wouldn't be able to restore power so quickly, and that's why they decided to detrain the passengers. And so I think on the Circle Line, there were 3 trains that were affected, and the process took maybe about 20 to 25 minutes. And that's why the Circle Line, the service was able to resume first. But for the north, south, and east, west lines, there were 12 trains in total that were affected. They managed to, detrain passengers from 11 trains, I think before 9 p.m. But there was that one last train where, it started raining, there was lightning risk. And so that took, it took much longer time for them to finally get those passengers off the train and at the station. And I think all these factors combined resulted in the total incident time lengthening to more than 3 hours.
Right. Now that the cause has been identified, preventive measures are well in place, or at least will be put in place. The contractor will replace all 22 kilovolt cables, as well as all 113 trip coils on Tuas West Extension. Now, while this is going on, SMRT will have more frequent checks on the trip coils and cables. Are these sufficient remedies, you think, Royston, that will prevent a similar breakdown from happening?
I think it definitely will help. I think this we learned today that this fault, that occurred, like for example, the trip coils that had never happened before, and that you're supposed to, as per the maintenance specifications, you're supposed to look at it once a year. So now that they are upping the frequency of the checks, I think that will help to make sure or try and prevent similar incidents from happening. The other thing to note is that in replacing the power cables, they aren't replacing it like for like. They are replacing it with higher specification cables, so cables with thicker insulation. So that should prevent a similar insulation fault from happening, where you have the cables fraying and a power fault occurring. The big question I think that remains unanswered is that the Tuas West Extension is still a very new MRT line. It opened in 2017. Now here we are in 2020. We're barely 3 years on, and yet we have these faults happening, and I don't think they have managed to find out exactly what is the cause behind these cables fraying. So it's a good measure to replace all the cables, and that should help prevent a repeat occurrence. But I think the other thing that needs to be done is to find out the root causes behind why the power cables failed in the first place. Because this is a very new MRT line. You wouldn't think that this happens so early in the life cycle of the line.
Right. Well, food for thought there, Royston. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Royston Sim, Deputy News Editor for the Straits Times.
7 new COVID-19 cases were confirmed today, which were all imported. They've been placed on stay-home notices when they arrived in Singapore. Now, more details on the new cases will be shared tonight.
The Health Ministry reported last night that Raffles City Shopping Centre, Bugis Junction and the arcade at the capital Kempinski had been added to the list of places visited by infectious COVID-19 patients. People who visited these places at the same time should monitor their health closely for 2 weeks from the date of their visit.
In other local news, facial and iris scans have replaced the fingerprint scans as the main mode for identifying travellers at immigration checkpoints. This will be at all checkpoints, land, sea and air. Now, over 2 million Singaporeans and 130,000 permanent residents have registered their iris and facial biometrics with the Immigration and Checkpoints Authority. Those who have not or are unsuccessful when using the iris and facial scans will still be able to check in by scanning their fingerprints.
Recovery for the labour market is likely to be slow and uneven, with resident unemployment rates taking a longer time to reach pre-crisis levels compared with during the global financial crisis. In its review of the macroeconomic situation, the Monetary Authority of Singapore said the unemployment rate of Singaporeans and PRs is expected to decrease gradually next year, but will remain elevated overall. MAS added that this will weigh on wages for the rest of this year and possibly into 2021. Now, these projections are despite employment prospects looking up in the immediate term in the retail and F&B sectors, as well as in support services like cleaning and security industries.
TikTok has plans to hire about 3,000 engineers over the next 3 years, including in Singapore. This comes after reports that TikTok owner ByteDance plans to invest billions of dollars in Singapore, which it has selected as its Southeast Asia headquarters. And the move shows that TikTok has not given up on its expansion plans, despite lingering uncertainty over its ownership.
Hey, Zouk is rolling out its pop-up cinematic experience, Zouk Cinema Club, from October 30th. Complete with Garrett popcorn, champagne and house pour spirits, the main room will be transformed into a cinema from Wednesday to Saturday nights from 6 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. There will be one screening session per night showing 2 movies. Capacity is limited to 50 people and 14 tables a night, and entry is restricted to those 18 years old and above.
Malaysia's king is calling on lawmakers to stop the political squabbling and give their full support to the upcoming budget.
In a statement issued this afternoon, the palace urged members of parliament to put the country first and make sure the budget for next year is passed when it's unveiled next Friday, November the 6th.
The king said that Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin retains his full confidence at a time when the country is battling the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Muhyiddin's future was initially cast into doubt over the weekend after the king rejected his request to declare a state of emergency.
We're pleased to have regional correspondent Leslie Lopez with us. He's been working the ground in Malaysia. So Leslie, run through what happened between the king's rejection of Mr. Muhyiddin's plan on Sunday through the last few days when a series of marathon meetings was reported. What happened behind the scenes?
Well, yeah, it's been pretty intense and fast-paced too. Sunday's rejection was tantamount to a rebuke by the palace on the Prime Minister, and that really, was a major setback and led him to even consider resigning that night. But from what we understand, he was persuaded by his close allies that he should remain, stay and see how matters unfold. What happened the next day was it was clear that there were strains within his Perikatan National Alliance. UMNO leaders, a major component of that alliance, basically refused to snub an invitation for a meeting with the Prime Minister with other coalition parties. Instead, they had their own meetings. In one of those meetings, which was the meeting of the National Front Coalition, it became clear that, which is quite a bombshell, when Najib Abdul Razak, who was an advisor to the coalition, announced that he would consider working with Anwar. That clearly, raised a lot of questions. People started looking at different permutations on how a new government could be formed. But all of that changed when UMNO Supreme Council met later in the night, and in the wee hours of Tuesday, declared that they were going to stick with Muhyiddin. But that pledge of support has come with a lot of conditions, which we understand include cabinet positions, senior positions too, including the deputy premiership. Question is, whether Muhyiddin will be able to meet these demands, and even if he does so this time around, how long can this situation last? Because UMNO will continue to make demands on him because of his very, very weak position now.
Right. Leslie, that's it. How would you describe then the current relationship between Mr. Muhyiddin and UMNO?
Well, I think it's testy to say the least. It's going to be, I think it's going to be very transactional. That's what's going to happen. We need to see how they meet the demands before next week's presentation of the budget, which is going to be crucial. There will be a vote on the budget, and it will be construed as a confidence vote on Muhyiddin. If he fails to pass the budget, then even this pledge of support clearly is not going to be enough for him to stay in power. So clearly, the relationship is transactional, testy, and I think what we've seen is there's quite a number of factions in UMNO. All of them have different views, different positions on how they think the relationship with Muhyiddin's Bersatu should take. So all of this are going to be, conditions are going to be also going to have huge impact on the relations in the coming days.
Right. So let's focus a bit on Anwar Ibrahim. No go in his prime ministerial bid this time. But as you mentioned, it's been reported that he's willing to team up with ex-Prime Minister Najib Razak. So what does this situation leave Mr. Anwar now, Leslie?
I think, it leaves Anwar in the same place he was in before he made the declaration that he had, he had built up a formidable majority to form the next government. He remains opposition leader. And I think this whole episode has shown that, Mr. Anwar's partners, particularly DAP and Amanah, need to work some kind of a new construct if they want to, build new alliances and get a majority. It is very evident that there is a problem with working with the DAP among parties like UMNO, PAS, and including the Sarawak Party, which is a key component to any government if it wants to come to power. So I think Anwar's immediate task now would be to try and make DAP more palatable, to the other political parties, if he still remains interested in pursuing this, his bid for the premiership.
Right. Thank you so much, Leslie, for setting aside time to speak with us. We've been speaking to the Straits Times regional correspondent, Leslie Lopez.
If you're watching us on YouTube, there's a link to Leslie's piece on the developments in Malaysia in the description below, but you have to be subscribed to the Straits Times to read it in full.
More headlines around the world. French drug maker Sanofi and Britain's GlaxoSmithKline plan to make 200 million doses of their COVID-19 vaccine candidate available to the World Health Organization's COVAX vaccine allocation plan. The two companies have currently signed a $2.1 billion deal with the US to supply it with more than 100 million doses. They also have deals with the European Union and UK. The first results from an early mid-stage study of the Sanofi GSK vaccine are expected in early December, with plans to file for regulatory approval next year.
Brunei's Prince Abdul Azim died from multiple organ failure due to an autoimmune disease. His younger brother, Prince Abdul Martin, revealed this in an Instagram post, saying it's what the late prince would have wanted. Prince Abdul Azim was diagnosed with severe systemic vasculitis earlier this year, a condition characterized by inflammation of blood vessel walls. At the same time, he was coping with bipolar disorder. He died last Saturday, and Brunei is now in a 7-day mourning period.
Over in the US, a self-help guru convicted of running a cult-like organization of sex slaves was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Keith Raniere was found guilty of coercing women into having sex with him as the leader of NextGem, a life coaching group of rich and famous devotees. The slaves were also made to hand over personal information and compromising photos. Some of the women had Raniere's initials branded on them. Raniere was convicted in June 2019 on all 7 charges brought against him, including racketeering, sex trafficking, extortion, criminal conspiracy, and the sexual exploitation of a 15-year-old girl.
And in sports, Barcelona president Josep Maria Bartomeu has resigned together with the rest of the board of directors. Bartomeu was facing a vote of no confidence that was due to be held next month after some 20,000 Barca fans signed a petition demanding that he step down. He had become a divisive figure during his near 7-year spell at the club. Most recently, he had been the focus of a very public fallout with superstar Lionel Messi after the Argentine had requested to leave the club this year. Well, those are our top stories for today. For more news and videos, visit straitstimes.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below.
Once again, I'm Haryanto Diman with Olivia Quay. Join us tomorrow for more stories on A Big Story.